Good morning and welcome to Networking with NIFA. I'm Joe Spitzen, Assistant Manager of the Regional Housing Accelerator Program at the Nebraska Investment Finance Authority. Lurking in the abyss off in the shadows is John Turner, Manager of Community Development Research, who has some camera issues today. Thank you for joining us. Today is a special edition of our Networking with NIFA Property Manager series, and our topic is domestic violence. You can find links to all of our previous sessions on NIFA.org and directly on YouTube under NIFA Housing. This webinar is being recorded and will be being posted later there today. Links will be posted in the chat here. To get started, today's presenters are Hilary Wasserburger, Leah Droge, and Linda Olson. Our moderator today is Leah Heflebower. Leah is a domestic violence and economic justice specialist at the Nebraska Coalition to End Sexual and Domestic Violence. It's all yours, Leah.
Thank you. Well, we greatly appreciate you inviting us. October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, but obviously domestic violence is an issue all year long for families across Nebraska and across our country. So thank you for highlighting that issue with us today. I am calling in on my phone rather than on the webcam because I'm also having technical issues. So we're all just winging it, going to make the best of it today. So I know that John had some polls queued up, and so we were just curious who was on the line today with us and what your roles were, so that we have a sense of who's going to be getting this information today. So it looks like those are posted. So if you're a property manager, landlord, owner, or rental property, you click yes. If you have some other role, click no.
Looks like they're rolling in. We've got 83% who voted so far. Just a few more seconds. Okay, it looks like I'll show the results here. Can you see them?
Yeah, so we have about a third of our participants are property managers, landlord, or owners of rental property, and about 2/3 have some other role. So we're great that we have a broad interest in this topic. That's wonderful. Thank you for joining us today. So let me see if I can get over to my screen. Joe, if you could help me I can share that, our presentation.
That's good. You should have control now.
Okay. All right, everybody seeing that?
Perfect.
Terrific. Okay, so joining me today are 3 of our network programs, Friendship Home, Bright Horizons, and the DOES program, and we appreciate them taking time out of their days today to work with us on this and share this important information. So the Nebraska Coalition to End Sexual and Domestic Violence, we have network programs clear across the state. Our agency helps provide technical assistance and capacity building support for those programs, as well as statewide advocacy for the issues of domestic violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking. So as you can see from the map, we have 20 different programs that cover every inch of the state. And it's important, particularly for folks in rural areas, to understand that they can access services. There may not be a program that has a physical office in their particular town, but there is an organization that does serve their area. So we want to be sure that all survivors understand that they have that ability to access services no matter where they live. We also have 4 tribal programs that we partner with if you're working with Indigenous persons, so that they can access specific services that are really particular to their particular needs. So our domestic violence programs do provide a wide variety of services. We consider them a lifeline to survivors. Often that's a really scary time when you're going through the trauma of domestic violence. And so having those programs available to provide those services and just offer a little bit of hope is really critical. They may be able to help the survivor stay in their own home. Often survivors may feel like in order to leave the relationship, they may have to completely uproot themselves, their children, start over someplace else. And our programs are very creative in accessing all of the supports that may be available in their community and across the state to help the survivors stay in their own home if that's something that they wish. So our programs, in addition to providing those case management supports and crisis supports, they do provide other range of services. Many of them do provide emergency shelter of various sorts, and they provide homeless prevention and diversion to try to solve those problems and help those situations get better so that people aren't having to access shelter. We know that can be really adds some additional trauma sometimes on top of the trauma that they've experienced from the violence that they're having to pull their families up out of their own home. So being able to divert them to other places that feel comfortable and safe is important as well. And then some of our programs do also have housing programs of their own, whether that's rental assistance for someone who's moving into their own apartment or a short-term transitional housing option. So it's important that survivors have a variety of options when they're looking at making that decision to leave a relationship, because it's such a difficult time. We want to make that transition for them as smooth as possible. So just so you have an idea of the scope of domestic violence that's occurring in Nebraska, we do individual point-in-time counts. And then in our count on 2019, we had 186 adult and child victims that were being served by the domestic violence programs in their emergency, transitional housing, or other housing programs that they were providing. But because of a lack of resources, 71 requests did go unmet, whether that's somebody who was trying to leave and the shelters programs were full, or weren't able to access exactly what they needed for their particular situation. So our programs are very creative in trying to meet as many of those needs as possible, but they are nonprofits, and so they are often stretched very thin. To give you an idea of the scope of domestic violence across the country, this is a public health crisis. It's very likely that you know somebody who has experienced domestic violence, or perhaps you yourself have experienced that as well. Over the course of their lifetime, 1 in 4 women and 1 in 9 men will experience severe, intimate partner physical violence, sexual violence, or stalking, with injuries, post-traumatic stress disorder, using the victim services, or contracting a sexually transmitted disease. Domestic violence is the leading cause of injury to women ages 15 to 44 years. That's why it's very important that we have a comprehensive response to this nationwide as well as in our local communities. And then domestic violence does account for 15% of all violent crime. There are a lot of resources that go towards addressing this issue and trying to minimize the frequency of that and the effects as well. So our programs are very much invested in doing what we can to reduce the incidence of domestic violence and respond to those situations when they do occur. John, actually, before we move on to introducing our presenters today, would you be willing to launch a poll for me also? I'm curious how many folks that are on our call today do you know and are aware of where their local domestic violence program is?
Looks like we got about 72% voted so far. I think maybe just a few more seconds here. We're at 83% of votes. Okay, I think you'll be happy with the results. I'm gonna close it now.
Can you share the results, John? I'm actually not able to see that on my screen.
Okay, well, I just shared them, and it says 71% said yes, they are familiar, they know their local programs, and 29% said no.
Well, that's good to know. And at the end of our program, we'll give you some information on how you can find your local program as well if you're interested in that. Okay, so we're going to move on to our first presenter so that they can share a little bit of information about themselves and about their organization. And that is Linda Olson with Bright Horizons.
Thank you. I'm very excited to present today and for that opportunity. Bright Horizons serves 10 counties in north central and northeastern Nebraska. And we have offices in Norfolk, O'Neill, and Ainsworth. We offer emergency shelter in Norfolk and in O'Neill, and we do also have a transitional program, housing program in Norfolk, and then we also have a program where we can do individual units across our 10 county service area. And we also provide additional programs. Would be our victims advocacy program, and we have an advocate on campus at Northeast Community College. I've worked in the field of domestic violence for over 22 years. I live in Holt County, and so I definitely bring a rural perspective. I'm also married to a farmer and rancher, so that rural perspective is very important to me. And Lee, I think you're muted.
Thank you, the joys of technology. Hilary, let's put you up next with the DOS program.
Great, thank you. My name is Hilary Wasserburger. I'm the Executive Director of the DOVES program, and I too am really excited to be here, so thank you so much for joining us. Lee, if you could go ahead and advance the slide.
I think I don't have control over the screen now.
Okay.
Let me see if I can get that back.
Okay. Well, while she's working on that, there we go, thank you. You can see there that the DOVES program serves 9 counties in western Nebraska, bordering South Dakota, Wyoming, and Colorado. We have 4 offices in the Gearing, Scottsbluff area, Chadron, Alliance, and Sidney. And we will soon be providing some rapid rehousing and homeless prevention services through a grant we received through the CARES program. Otherwise, we use a hotel model for emergency shelter so that we're able to accommodate requests in all, well, 7 of our 9 counties that actually have hotels. We too represent a very rural part of Nebraska and definitely experiencing housing and shelter issues. We do not have an emergency shelter in our community, which puts more of a burden on our housing community. So again, I'm really excited to see property managers and landlords here, as well as everyone else. So thanks for having us.
Wonderful, thank you, Hilary. Leah, Friendship Home.
Great, thank you. I'm also happy to be here this morning. My name is Leah Droge, and I'm the Assistant Director of Program Development at Friendship Home. And Friendship Home serves Lincoln and Lancaster County. Last year, we served over 1,500 survivors and their children through shelter or services. We provide crisis services, emergency shelter, transitional housing, and a few years ago, we started a rapid rehousing project. So we provide shelter in a variety of fashions. Being in a more quote unquote urban area of Nebraska, we're fortunate to have a few more options than my rural partners here, and we definitely appreciate that. I know it's a struggle in the rural communities. So we provide a scattered site model for some of our shelter, as well as a communal shelter option, which has really allowed us to provide a broader array of options to the survivors in our community.
Thank you, Leah. Could each of you share a little bit about how the COVID pandemic has affected your services and what flexibility you've had to have and what services you're still offering?
Horizons, we still are full operational. We have reduced our shelter capacity so that we can socially distance. So we are sheltering, usually we shelter 5 families at a time in our Norfolk emergency shelter, and we're doing 3 families. Usually we can do families in our own shelter, and we're doing 1 family per shelter. We're using hotels to make up that difference. So of course that is an extra cost to our program. But our offices are open, trying to provide the, those emergency services as possible for not only our clients, but also our staff.
And Hilary, how about Dove's program?
Well, when we originally were kind of at the beginning of the COVID crisis, we did close our offices. All of our staff continued to work and worked remotely, but we definitely saw a decrease in the number of people reaching out for services, especially shelter services, because of course, maybe both partners are at home, kids are being homeschooled, so that just makes it even more difficult for survivors of domestic violence to reach out for help and or leave. We reopened our offices at the beginning of June, and one of the trends we saw immediately was that the people coming to us were at a much higher risk than previously. And I think, again, that's a direct result of the shutdown, is that unfortunately cases escalated much higher before someone could reach out. So we were dealing with several clients who legitimately feared they would be killed, and that is not typically what we see. Since then, we are seeing a little bit more of the normal workload, I would say, as far as the type of cases, but we are definitely seeing an increase in the number of people who are seeking financial assistance, especially rent assistance, utility assistance, maybe help relocating out of the area. So there's been a much bigger demand on our services for that financial piece. And as I mentioned, we're excited that we'll be able to offer some assistance through the CARES grant that we received, and several of our housing partners also did. So I think that will make a big difference in the Panhandle. But other than that, we are business as usual, except for just taking extra precautions. So we encourage people to, come to our offices, just please socially distance, wear masks. One other quick note, we were really able to implement a texting line during this time, something we'd wanted to do, but we kind of had to do it, and that's been a huge improvement for so many people, that texting is their way of communicating, so they can reach out to us that way 24 hours a day, and we're seeing clients stay more in touch with us when they don't have to call in, so I think that's actually been an improvement because of COVID.
Thank you, Hilary. Leah, tell us about how Lincoln and Lancaster County, how you've been serving them during this time.
Yeah, so we have continued to provide emergency shelter through those single family shelter scattered site units, as well as doing some hotel motel placement. We've also seen a little bit of a roller coaster with requests for shelter and services. So early April, we saw quite a dip, and as Hilary had mentioned, we're very concerned about that. We know that it doesn't mean that domestic violence is no longer happening, but rather that survivors may not be able to reach out safely for assistance. We have seen that start to rebound. I will tell you that at Friendship Home, we typically have more demand for shelter space than immediate availability, and that's been true for us for 25 years, even as we've increased capacity. So last year, on average, about 38 adults and children each day were waiting for emergency shelter, and we're up to 30 again at this point in time, so it's creeping back up. We're also seeing very risky situations. To echo what Hilary shared, we're part of our local coordinated community response with law enforcement, and we're all in agreement that we're seeing some very high risk, high lethality situations. So we're getting a lot of calls from survivors that again, are very concerned about, if I don't leave during this window of time, I'm concerned that this will be the end of my time. So we're doing a lot of quick placement with the resources we have available. We also were fortunate to partner on a project with some CARES Act funding. So we're looking forward to provide some rapid rehousing for survivors in our community with that soon.
Terrific. Well, we appreciate that all of the work that you all have been doing to make sure that survivors are able to reach out and get services in a really, really unique time. And it's pretty frightening for survivors who are stuck at home with their abusers and not feeling like they can reach out. So it's good to know that you all are still there. Before we move on too far, as we're going to be talking a little bit about how landlords and property managers can work with programs and work with survivors. But could some of you address how you ensure that survivors have their privacy and confidentiality? How you can ensure that when they're reaching out to programs and yet still working with some other partners?
All of the domestic violence programs are very strict confidentiality guidelines, and so that is per state statute, per federal law, per our grant guidelines, and it's so important for the victims that we work with that those services are confidential, especially in the small communities. They have to have that confidence that what they share with us or that they are using our services is kept confidential. Sometimes that can lead to some frustrations with partners, whether that's law enforcement or property owners, landlords. You know, they might know that they're working with us, but if someone calls and says, you know, I need to talk to someone that's in our shelter, you know, we can't confirm or deny that we're working with someone unless we have a release of information. I always tell people in our community with Jill and say, I want to post a message. That we have to confirm working with someone, but we have been in our communities and have built trust with other partners that they know if there's any way that we can message that victim that we will. And that has worked well for us.
Thank you. I appreciate you sharing that. It's so important that survivors feel safe reaching out and knowing that their information isn't going to be shared widely. So Linda, I'm going to pass it on to you to be our presenter for the next section on domestic violence.
Thank you. And do you want to go to that next slide then?
Yes, can you see it?
Yeah, I would like to start off with just a couple of disclaimers. We tend to use survivor and victim interchangeably. I much prefer the term survivor, but I do find myself using the word victim, especially for someone that is still in that situation. So just so you know, if you hear the word survivor or victim, those are interchangeable. A couple of the myths about domestic violence, that it isn't bad and it doesn't happen in our communities. And I hear that a lot in the rural communities. People feel that their community is safe, their neighborhoods are safe. It doesn't happen in my church, my congregation, it doesn't happen with my culture. But domestic violence can happen to anyone, male, females, all races, ethnicity, all economic backgrounds, social classes, all ages. It does not matter. And the domestic violence programs, I think another big myth is that we only work with women. And that's another disclaimer I need to put out. We do overwhelmingly work with more women than men because domestic violence does affect more women than men. That is proven statistically, and that's what we see in our programs. So sometimes you will hear us referring to a survivor as she, but please know that we do work with men. Victims, we work with people in same-sex relationships also. Another myth is that domestic violence is an impulse control or an anger management problem, and this definitely false. Abusers deliberately choose who to abuse. And that says they can't control their anger at home, but they lash out at home, can go to work and many times hold up, no problem at all. They're choosing who they're using that violence with. Another myth is that alcohol, drugs, or stress, job stress, cause domestic violence. They can be contributing factors, but they definitely do not cause someone to become abusive. If you want to go to the next slide, please. When we look at domestic violence as programs across the state, we look at a broad spectrum of behaviors. So we look at everything from yelling at your partner to murder. But domestic violence is centered on one person wanting power and control over another person. So it's a person in that home, whether that is usually their spouse or partner. And there's many different methods that people use, that abusers use. They use coercion and threats, intimidation, emotional abuse, isolation, minimizing, denying, and blaming, using children, male privilege, and economic abuse. And all this, again, is centered on wanting power and control over one person. All of this then is surrounded by physical and sexual violence that plays a part. Now, some people never, ever physically abuse their partner, but they can use a lot of other tactics. Usually it starts out very subtly and slowly, and sometimes it's over very minor things, using that coercion or intimidation. And I always tell young women or teens when I work with them or do presentations in schools, you know, if you went out with someone and on the first date they hit you, of course you would never go out with them again, and you would tell all your friends not to. But it starts out very subtly and very slowly. And so what happens then for victims is if they start feeling like they're being controlled, it's what's, you know, you're too sensitive, you can't take a joke, you're overreacting. And so that helps keep that person in control, the abuser in control. A lot of these methods are supported by society standards. And a lot of these tactics aren't against the law. And, you know, I always think of one woman that I worked with, and she came into our office, and she said her counselor had sent her. And so when I sat down with her, she said, I don't even know what you guys do here. And I told her we worked with victims of domestic violence. You know, have you been affected by domestic violence? And she said, oh, no. And I knew the counselor, so I knew that she would not have sent her to us if that wasn't true. And so I said, let me ask you some questions. And I started asking about these other tactics, coercion and threats, intimidation, emotional abuse. And she checked everything, but he had never hit her. And so she felt she wasn't a victim of domestic violence. Isolation in our rural communities many times is a huge factor. There have been twice that it was the rural mail carrier that helped get someone out of a situation. One time a woman had to put a note in the mailbox to please call the sheriff and have him come and get me because of the isolation, no access to transportation. And so when you're working with a family or you have a family living in one of your units, please look at the broad spectrum of, you know, does one partner seem to do all the decisions? Does one partner seem to have all the access to the funds? Does one partner seem to intimidate the others? And so again, when we work with women, we want them to look at all aspects of this. Many times when you explain this to women, they're like, I didn't realize all that was part of the abuse. I didn't realize not allowing me to work or calling and harassing me at work till I lost my job, was part of that abuse. And again, so much of this is not against the law. And so therefore, when law enforcement is called, many times there's nothing that they can do unless it has escalated into the physical or sexual violence. Do you want to go to the next slide? Why doesn't she or he just leave? This is the question that advocates see. We should be asking, I do better. And nothing's going to change until we start holding batters accountable, abusers accountable. The answer to this question is so complicated, and it is it's varied depending on the victim. And we know that the time of greatest risk of harm to a victim is when they threaten to leave or when they do actually leave. A recent study of intimate partner homicides found that 20% of the homicide victims were actually not domestic violence victims themselves, but family members, friends, persons who intervened, law enforcement responders, or bystanders. And so, again, this is the greatest time of risk for the woman and her children, or the male, but also for family members. The next slide will show us some of the reasons or barriers to leaving abusive relationships. Again, no one is abusive all the time. And many times survivors still love the abuser. There's good times. And that sometimes is more controlling than anything else, is that hope that things will get better. There's good times, this is the person that they fell in love with. This is the person that they know they can be. This is how happy this home could be all the time if they just maybe gave them more time, were more understanding. So that can be controlling and keep men or women in a relationship longer. The fear of becoming homeless is huge, and that's a reality. I have never worked with a domestic violence victim that came out financially better off than they were when they were married. And the fear of becoming homeless is a reality, because most often the is the one that leaves the home and leaves everything behind. Fear that the abuser will get custody of the children is another huge one we see all the time, and it's something I would never want a survivor to take lightly. Many times the abusing partner is the one that has had the access to the financial resources, has had that better paying job, and they're the ones that can afford a good lawyer. Fear that they will harm them, their children, family members, and again, the statistics show that that's a real concern. Fear that they will harm or kill pets. Many times we get calls from victims that want to leave, but they're afraid to leave their pets. And finding housing that will accept pets is sometimes very, very hard. And so that can be a huge barrier for families. And a lack of transportation, and especially in the rural communities, you can't get anywhere. We try very hard to make our services accessible as possible. We have offices spread across our service area, but they're still 75 miles apart, the offices. So that lack of transportation to get to safety. One time we worked with a woman that when the school bus pulled into the yard, she ran out with the baby and said, go, 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 you know, and the bus took her to the school. The school called a pastor, and then the pastor contacted us because she was here in our rural communities and didn't know anyone and had no access to transportation. So that can be a huge barrier for families. If you want to go to the next slide, please. That financial control and other financial issues, Hilary's going to go into that a little bit more, but in rural areas, this is a huge concern because, as you know, farm and ranch families can be very wealthy on paper. They can be land rich and cash poor. We worked with numerous women that were millionaires based on their assets of owning farmland, but had absolutely no access to that cash, no access to any of those funds. And the other thing, rural divorces take years. We've worked with several families that the whole divorce process took over 2 years because they were working and dividing land assets up, cattle up, machinery up. That's a very, very complicated process. And many times those victims don't qualify for some government programs or low-income housing because, again, the assets that they have. So that can be a huge issue. The isolation, not having close family or friends is huge, but also maybe their family and friends aren't supportive. You know, many victims say their parents are fed up with that, with the abuse. They, you know, the old "you made your bed, now lie in it" mentality. This can be, again, like I said before, that isolation in rural communities. So many times women are brought here and have no close family and friends in the rural communities. The immigration issues, it can be a huge barrier to leaving if the victim or survivor is not a documented worker, doesn't have, you know, then you don't have a way to get a job. You can't qualify for some housing. You know, the user will threaten to turn them into the nation. Religious and cultural beliefs, many times anything that can be supportive for a victim can also be turned and used against them. That religious, spiritual support that most people thought that would be a huge benefit can be turned against them. And many times, you know, you hear the Bible verses quoted, or the man's the head of the household, and some cultures or religions don't support divorce. Fear of law enforcement's response or the legal system not holding the abusers accountable. Again, this is another very real concern for survivors. It takes a long time for a court case to go through. The abuser's not going to be in jail probably all that time. And even when the court case gets all done, I have never had a victim that, boy, I this is work. Many times the sentences are very light, a couple days in jail, and this is after months and months of working towards that. Most victims just want the abuse to end. They don't necessarily want the abuser jailed. Many times the abuser is the breadwinner of the family. If he is in jail, the family, the survivor and her children have no way to support themselves. So that fear of law enforcement's response, just individual officers, but then the whole legal system. And then many times they have a lack of knowledge of or access to resources, support, and safety. And this is where I see property managers, landlords having the greatest impact, is just to educate yourself, have information available so that you know the resources, and then you can post that information in lobbies or have that available. Some other things that we see, just if survivors sleep with children, knowledge that single parenting is hard and the reality of the financial circumstances. Again, like I said, I've never worked with a victim in the 22 years financially ahead. Sometimes there's just a belief that a two-parent household is better for children. And then the other thing to be aware of is most victims feel very ashamed. That is the first thing a domestic violence program is going to do, is assure them that it's not their fault, that you know, and support them where they're at. But there is a lot of shame of acknowledging or admitting to your family, your friends, to anyone that this has been going on in your home. I always say the hardest thing a person does is walk in our door that first time. It is very hard to reach out for help. And the other thing I want people to be aware of is leaving is a process. It takes a lot of time. I think statistics, there's an old statistic out that a woman or a victim leaves 7 times before they finally get away. And I don't know if that statistic still holds true today, but it's probably not very far off. It is a process. Each time we work with families, if they do go back, we feel that at least they've learned something. They now know where our services are at. They now know we're here for them. They now know we're not going to judge them. You know, they now know that we work with men. Maybe they didn't know that before. But to support that family, the survivor and the children trying to leave and get out of that situation, just know that it is a process. People leave every day, but it is a process. And this can cause some frustration with family members, friends, and landlords. You know, you think, geez, I did this and this, and now he's back in the picture. And just to be understanding of how many things have to change for a survivor to truly be able to get away from that, all the ties that go with that. So just to understand that, to be there for those families. So if you want to go on to the next slide.
Thank you, Linda. I appreciate you giving us that nice foundation about domestic violence. There's so many factors that go into that, and it's important that our community members understand that. We're going to pass it over to Hilary now to talk about why housing is so important to survivors.
Okay, thanks, Lee. That seems like kind of a silly question. Why is housing so important to survivors? But honestly, housing is important to all of us. But if you've been living in a home that was not safe, the concept of housing kind of takes on a whole new meaning. Unfortunately, what we know is that there is a very strong intersection between domestic violence and homelessness. Studies have shown that 80% of women and children who are homeless had previously experienced domestic violence, and 57% of homeless women report that domestic violence was the immediate cause of their homelessness. So that's almost 60% of homeless women who became homeless directly as a result of domestic violence. What that number doesn't capture, even though it's such a high number, is the people who have left an abusive relationship, and maybe initially they had a plan. They had a safe place to go. They were going to stay with friends and family. and something fell through. Maybe they wore out their welcome, or it became less safe for them to stay there. And so now maybe 6 weeks or 6 months later, they're homeless again, or still homeless. That may not be immediately related to domestic violence, but it's still related to domestic violence. So I would just encourage you, when you're looking at that 57%, that number is much higher. We had a gal contact us just last week who has been homeless since 2019. Living in a car, living in a trailer that was not habitable because she left an abusive situation. So she's going on almost a year of dealing with homelessness because of that. And so not only does domestic violence cause homelessness, but it also makes people more vulnerable to continued or new incidents of violence. Some studies have shown that women and men who have experienced either food or housing insecurity in a 12-month period had significantly higher prevalence rates of rape, physical violence, stalking by an intimate partner in that same period compared to those who had not experienced food or housing insecurity. So we know that if someone is homeless, they're more at risk of being sexually assaulted, they're more at risk to human trafficking. And unfortunately, we know that people sometimes are forced to use survival sex as a way to survive. So again, this is not uncommon for programs like ours to hear from someone who says, you know, can you provide shelter to me? I thought this person was a friend. He offered to let me stay for a few weeks till I got on my feet, and now he's demanding sex in exchange for that safe place to stay. And I need to get out of here. So unfortunately, we see that causation of homelessness, and then we also see that it makes people more vulnerable. And so what this means really is that for survivors of domestic violence, housing equals safety. The two kind of go hand in hand. And I will never forget this little boy we served in the shelter. I know the focus of our presentation today is more on housing, but in this situation, it was emergency shelter. He and his mom had come into shelter. I'd gotten them all settled in, and I was getting ready to leave for the evening. And I asked Mom, what time do I need to be here tomorrow to get your little guy to school? And you could tell immediately she was really uncomfortable. And she said, you know, I just need you to know that we've had a lot of trouble getting ready for school. We have had some truancy issues. We've had some tardy issues. He just kind of acts out in the morning, and it's really hard for him to get ready, and it's a really frustrating experience. And you could tell she felt like really ashamed of it, and she was already dreading that I was going to witness that the next day and that it was going to impact me as well. And so, you know, I said, well, why don't I just get here a little bit early? We'll see how things go, and we'll go from there. We can deal with it. It's, you know, that's not to be unexpected. So the next morning I showed up at about 7:30. And this little guy is sitting on the couch with his little coat on, zipped up to his chin, his backpack on his back, his shoes on and tied, jumps up and says, I'm ready to go. And no problems at all, no behavior issues at all. He was ready to go. And you could tell his mom was kind of flabbergasted. And she finally just asked him, she's like, why don't you ever get ready like this at home? And he looked at her and said, because I know you're going to be safe today, Mom, and skipped to the door. And I mean, it was kind of a heartbreaking moment, but it was also so validating for her to know that she'd made the right decision leaving. But that little boy was acting that way because he didn't want to leave his mom home because he didn't know if she was going to be safe while he was at school. So housing is safety. And we can't underestimate how important it is for women, children, and men to have a safe home to go to. Survivors tell us that the two most pressing concerns for them are housing and the economic resources to maintain that safety. Yes, many of our survivors also need help navigating the criminal justice system or the civil justice system, or they need medical advocacy because they've been abused or assaulted. They may need just basic things like food and hygiene items because they're not able to provide those. But their most pressing concerns are housing and those economic resources. And without housing, survivors are hesitant to even attempt to leave their abusers. Linda mentioned that that's one of the barriers, is that fear of homelessness. So if I'm having to choose and my options are either stay and be abused or be homeless, is that really a choice? But that's what victims are dealing with all the time is, do I stay here where the abuse is happening, but at least my kids have a safe place where we have a roof over our heads? Or do I take that leap and risk homelessness? And that should just be unacceptable to us, that those are the two choices, but they are. One thing I'd like to point out here, I was super excited to see that 70+% of you know your local program. That's wonderful. If you don't, I really encourage you to reach out after this webinar, and we would be glad to visit with you, let you know our resources. But regarding this point, if survivors have a chance to connect with their local program while they're just anticipating whether they want to leave or not, we have a great opportunity to work with them to come up with a plan before their only options are either abuse or homelessness. It may mean that they don't just leave. It may mean that we plot a plan together. Maybe they would qualify for low-income housing, but they don't have access to their birth certificates. Programs like ours can help them purchase those. We can, if we have enough time, we can get those purchased so that they can apply and get on the waiting list and at least shorten some of that time. So again, if you know someone who is contemplating leaving, they don't have to have left to use our services. They can just say, I'm thinking about leaving. I want to know what my resources are. And that's one way that we can really help change the dynamics of the tough choices that they're making. And then again, this seems pretty obvious, but having safe, affordable housing is really a crucial step to that long-term security. If people are bouncing around from family member to family member or friend to friend, or kids are moving from school to school, it's really hard to ever start the healing process. It's hard to ever really kind of get your feet under you. So getting that housing piece addressed first is really important for safety and for other reasons. Linda mentioned a lot of the reasons why it's hard for survivors to leave, and a lot of those are the same reasons it's hard for them to find housing. For one thing, housing is just hard to find. I mean, unfortunately, that's a reality across our state, across our country, but survivors really may have unique needs that we need to take into account. Regarding safety, maybe there's someone who is not going to feel comfortable living on a ground floor, and that's the only apartment available. Or maybe they feel like they need some reinforcements. They need a security door on the front of the apartment. Maybe they want a garage so that they can hide their vehicle. One thing we know is that trauma can really affect people's sense of safety. And so as a landlord or property manager, you might have a very safe or secure unit, but if you're able to help provide additional safety based on a survivor's needs, that can go a long way. We know that survivors really, a lot of them need confidentiality. If they really don't want their abusive partner to know anything about where they're living, it's important that we help them set that up in the most confidential way possible, or even just keep it confidential who's assisting that person. We know that perpetrators often stalk, sabotage, and assault victims even after they've fled, and that's why confidentiality is so important. That's why there are some protections under the Violence Against Women Act that Leah is going to talk about in the next section that are really important for you to be aware of, so that you can help make sure you're not exposing your renters or tenants to further violence. And then I mentioned trauma. Trauma really decreases that sense of safety and can increase that concept of really intense fear. So the lower barriers that we impose on victims, the more voluntary we make all of the services that we provide to them, the more we're providing those trauma-informed services. On top of the unique needs that a survivor may have, then you're also piling on top of that maybe the individual needs that that person has. So maybe a woman had her elderly father living in the home with her and her partner and their kids, and now that she's fleeing and trying to find her own housing, she has 3 generations of family to house. That can be kind of challenging. That may require, housing that's not widely available. Maybe they have a large family, and You know, we worked with a gal just the other day who had 6 children. So trying to find housing for 7 people, she really had a hard time finding that. So again, these are things that any large family would struggle with, but then you again are looking at the impact of domestic violence. It just can sometimes seem impossible. Maybe the family has ability issues. Maybe someone's in a wheelchair and needs wheelchair accessibility. Maybe a survivor requires in-home care. So those can make finding housing a little bit more difficult. Linda mentioned pets. Pets are an important part of families, and I know I wouldn't want to leave my little kitties behind, but finding a place that allows pets can be really challenging. And then unfortunately, we know that discrimination is alive and well in housing. We know that for Native Americans, people of color, people who identify as LGBTQ, people with disabilities, housing discrimination is real. Unfortunately, I witnessed that firsthand. I was working with a client, and for some reason, I was the one who called the landlord, which isn't normally how we do things, but I had called about a particular unit, and he said, yep, it's still available. In fact, I'm here right now if you guys want to come down and check it out, or if you want to come down and check it out. About 10 minutes later, we got there, and me and my Native American client walked in, and he told us immediately that, nope, that unit's been rented. So in 10 minutes, the unit that was rented, no, he just did not want to rent to a Native American gal. And for her, she's like, I knew this was going to happen. I knew it was going to happen. So unfortunately, discrimination can be a big thing that makes it very difficult for people to find housing. Linda also mentioned financial abuse, and I just saw this quote the other day, and I love it. I'm going to go ahead and read it just in case. I don't know if there's anyone who's only on the phone, but it says, abusers have always been financially controlling, but recently abusers are forcing their victims to apply to payday lenders with absolutely no intention of ever paying back the loan, forcing their victims to obtain student loans and then working to sabotage their education, and forcing their victims to put all credit card debt and loans in her name while putting all assets in his. In the past, domestic violence victims would leave with nothing but their children and the clothes on their back. Now they leave with crushing debt. And this just really spoke to me because it is so true. I mean, I've been doing this work for almost 20 years, and things really have changed that way. And we are seeing people come to us and just have no idea where to even start because, you know, he's left them with bad credit. He's left them with bills in their name. He claimed he was going to be paying all of the bills, but he wasn't paying the bills. And so this just really spoke to me. I even remember a woman who quit claimed her house to her abusive partner just to be done with him. And that house had been passed on to her by her mother. And so she not only had to give away basically her mother's house to get away from this guy, but she then became homeless because she was not able to find other housing. And other people would look at that like, what a stupid decision. But for her, that was worth it to be done with this guy. So abusers are really good at finding ways to help their financial situation and hurt their partners. So the effects of financial abuse, and we've kind of touched on some of these, but one is just a lack of resources. A lot of our clients are not able to work or not allowed to work, or every effort they've made to work has been sabotaged. So they just honestly don't have resources. They just don't have money to set up a new household, to flee to a different place where they have family maybe. So either they just don't have those resources or they don't have access to those resources like Linda talked about. They may have poor credit history. This may be their own responsibility, or it may be the effects of the abuser. Again, running up those credit card bills, sabotaging student loans, and overall just leaving them where, you know, if you're a landlord who does run a background check or a credit check, you may not want to take a risk on this person. Poor rental history, maybe they have been evicted several times because of an abuser's behavior. And again, and maybe it's because of their own responsibility, but we know that these are the tactics that abusers use. And oftentimes you can get the story from people when you talk about it, when they say, well, you know, we decided to go ahead and move out of that neighborhood. And what you really find is that they were forced out because the abuser was, you know, having the police called all the time. The yelling and screaming was upsetting other neighbors. Maybe other people felt in danger because of the abuser's behavior. So you might see a poor rental history. I mentioned that lack of steady employment or income because of the abuse. I remember one gal we worked with years and years ago, but she worked in a bank as a teller, and her partner would literally sit in the bank lobby, and anytime a male customer or a male coworker came up to her window, he would accuse her of sleeping with him and just cause a scene. And the bank honestly did a great job. They are a great example. That woman still works at that bank because they understood what was going on and they helped her keep that job. But many people are not able to or not willing to put up with that. I know I had another client who worked at a law firm, and her abusive partner would drop her off, pick her up for lunch, drop her off after lunch, pick her up after work. He would call her constantly to make sure she was sitting at her desk. And the law firm, again, did a great job of calling us and saying, can you come here? Because there's no way she can leave. He monitors her all the time. And while our advocate was there visiting with her, he called like 30 times. Another great example of an employer who did what they needed to do to try to keep that person employed. But again, not everyone can do that, and it's not reasonable to expect people to be able to do that. So that often leads to people having a spotty work history and not steady employment. It's possible that the abuser controls the lease. Maybe his name is the only one on the lease or her name, and there's not a way for her to address that. And then also, survivors are often so isolated, they may not know that there are housing protections under VAWA that would help them. And so again, connecting them with a local program, and as landlords and property owners, being aware of those VAWA protections can be really helpful. Another issue is just the general lack of subsidized or affordable housing. I mean, this is a nationwide problem. Only 1 in 4 people who are eligible for public housing receives it. I feel really fortunate in the Panhandle because our waiting time for like Section 8 vouchers or public housing units is usually, maybe 2 to 6 weeks. There's been times it's run a little bit longer than that, but I know in other parts of the state, that's not the case. I know in some parts of the country, people wait 3 to 5 years for a Section 8 voucher. So there is just a general lack of subsidized or other affordable housing. And unfortunately, on the next slide, we talk about even if a victim is able to get subsidized or affordable housing, sometimes she loses it. It may be that the abuser has caused a lease or voucher policy violation. I can think of several of our clients who maybe we help them get into their own apartment, into their own unit at public housing, and soon enough, there he is. And Linda mentioned that this can be really frustrating for landlords, like, hey, I tried to help you and now he's back. Oftentimes they don't really have a choice. He kind of just bulls his way in there, and it's really hard to get him out. It may not be safe to get him out. And so that could result in a lease or a voucher violation, which then makes them both homeless. And then I mentioned also repeated calls to police. Property damage. We work with so many women who are not eligible for public housing or Section 8 vouchers because of damage done to the property by the abuser. Our goal, if we can, is to help them pay that off so that they can then be eligible for subsidized housing, because that is going to be a better option for them. But it's really frustrating to think that we're paying for the damage done by an abuser. So we know that abusers use that both as an intimidation and a scare tactic, but also it can limit their resources later, a survivor's resources later. And then I also mentioned the risk of harm to others. Unfortunately, landlords and property managers have to think about all of their tenants. And if someone is posing a risk, it's understandable sometimes that could lead to the loss of affordable housing for a victim. It's unfortunate, but it's understandable. But if we can avoid that by putting some of these other supports in place, that would help. I think we'll have time at the end for questions. So I think at this point, I'm going to pass it back to Lee and let her take it away.
Thank you, Hilary. I really appreciate you highlighting the importance of housing for survivors and in addressing domestic violence in our communities. We're going to pass it over to Leah Droge now. Leah is going to give the property managers and community members on the call today some really concrete steps that they can do to help assist survivors. So Leah?
Great, thank you. Yes, this last section is definitely targeted more towards property managers and landlords, but I hope everyone who's on the webinar today will find what's applicable for you. And as Hilary mentioned, we'll have time for questions at the end. So if it sparks anything for you, please go ahead and put that in the chat. So we're going to jump into some warning signs to be aware of if you are someone that's working with tenants. So this next slide is going to be focused more on specific behaviors that you might want to be paying attention to. Lee, can you go to the next slide?
Can you see it, Leah?
Nope. That's okay. I can keep talking. So one of the things that you might see is a repeated late payment of rent. And I know Hilary just did a really great job of an overview of those financial control tactics. So what you might be seeing is a representation of that coercion. Got it. Perfect. Thank you. There might be the physical evidence of assaults, so injuries or wearing dark glasses, wearing long sleeves, even in warm weather, or heavy makeup to cover bruises. You might see signs of isolation. So if there are fewer visitors to that family or change in the tenant's behavior. So if this is someone that typically was out chatting with their neighbors frequently or even stopping by your office and now you're not seeing them or only seeing them in the presence of their partner, that might be something to pay attention to. And then Linda mentioned this earlier, but if this is someone that is always having to defer to their partner for permission, that is another warning sign to be aware of. All right, and then the next slide is more specific to property-related warning signs. So if you're seeing broken locks or doors that have been kicked in, smashed lights, broken windows, holes punched or kicked in walls. One thing I've seen several times is abusers who have taken all of the victims' clothing and other belongings and piled them in the living room and poured bleach over them. So then they're staining to the carpet. If there are noise complaints, so if other tenants are coming to you and saying, hey, I heard next door again last night that there was a lot of fighting happening. Obviously, this is a pattern of behavior to be concerned about. One thing we're seeing more as victim service providers is not just where survivors are being restrained from leaving, but situations where they're actually being forced out. So we've had many calls over the last several years where survivors will call sometimes in the middle of winter and say, I was fighting with my partner. He literally pushed me out the door. I have our 6-month-old baby in my arms and then he locked the door behind me and all I have on is my pajamas. So that's another thing that we're seeing more often, that pattern of behavior. You might also see stalking. So the abusive partner who's maybe coming to you for information about that tenant or again, seeking it from neighbors, trying to get a sense of where the survivor's going and when and with whom. So that's another warning sign to pay attention to. Next slide, please. So this next piece is going to speak more about thinking of ways you can create a sense of community on your property. So if your tenants know that you care about them, they're more likely to let you know if something's wrong in their family. You could also model respectful relationships, not only with them, but with your staff members, having respectful communication and problem solving. You can help your tenants get to know one another. So consider creating a communal bulletin board in places where tenants might gather, such as the mailroom or the laundry area. That might also be a great place that they can post announcements for one another or brochures of community events and resources, such as your local domestic violence program. You might also organize events and ask your tenants for input on topics of interest. I know we've, for a few years now, been asked to come out to one of our local subsidized housing programs and speak with their tenants every October for Domestic Violence Awareness Month. And that's been a really great partnership just to be able to share that information and answer questions about our services. All right, I am still, I think, a couple slides behind. Perfect, caught up, thank you.
You got it, VAWA?
I got it, thank you. So we're going to do a couple slides here on the Violence Against Women Act. This is a very brief overview, so that's my disclaimer. This is obviously pretty extensive legislation, so I believe John's going to put a link in the chat if you want to go and look at details of it. So the Violence Against Women Act is federal legislation. There have been several versions of the act, and in 2013, that version expanded and clarified protections in all federally subsidized housing properties. And you have some examples there of what this might cover. And just to clarify, although the legislation is named the Violence Against Women Act, it applies to all survivors of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking, regardless of sex, gender identity, or sexual orientation. Because we never know who might experience these forms of violence, for these properties, it's important to provide the notice of occupancy rights under VAWA and certification forms to all applicants and tenants. HUD provided a final rule on this in 2016, stating that no one can be denied assistance and tenants may not be terminated under a covered housing program for factors resulting from the fact that they have been a victim of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking. So there's several protections available under VAWA. This process starts when that victim or survivor would file paperwork with you as the landlord or property manager, certifying that they've experienced one of those forms of violence. And one of the things that's covered under it would include bifurcating the lease. So if this is a family where both the abusive partner and the survivor are on the lease, it spells out the process for bifurcating that. It allows for the survivor to remain in the home. There's an emergency transfer process as well, and HUD has provided different examples of that certification form, as well as the notice of occupancy rights and that emergency transfer plan. So if you're someone who's looking for those, the good news is there are some templates available. It would also allow for a survivor to move to another apartment or house that's owned by the landlord if a safe unit is immediately available. And if this is someone who has a voucher through a housing authority, it also provides for that survivor to transfer their voucher. One of the most important things to know about this is the final rule also clarified that no third-party documentation is required. So survivors or victims are able to self-certify what they've experienced through that form. And the only time or situation that there would be third-party documentation needed would be if there's conflicting accounts of what's happening. Confidentiality is also critical to this. So anything that's disclosed to you through that certification form is confidential material and would not be able to be shared beyond that landlord-tenant relationship. All right, next slide, please. Thank you. So due to the dynamics of domestic violence, we know that survivors are often hesitant to reach out for assistance. And there may be unexpected, systematic consequences for that intervention. The survivor may want the safety and accountability for the harm done towards them, but also might be concerned about entanglement in other complex systems. So I can tell you, for instance, in my community, if law enforcement are called and there are children present in that household, because of our mandatory child abuse reporting law, automatically DHHS, Child and Family Services, becomes aware of that family. And there are many survivors I've worked with over the years that are also aware of that dynamic, and that has precluded them in some situations from calling law enforcement. So it's important that we trust that each victim or survivor knows their own situation best and what may help or what might harm. I know another option that we often refer survivors to is getting an order of protection. And it's important to remember that this is a process. Survivors can certainly submit an affidavit. However, a judge makes the final decision. The most recent statistics I've seen from 2016, the overall state protection order approval rate in Nebraska was 57%. And it's also important to keep in mind that any information that survivor lists on that affidavit is something that abusive partner also sees, in which case it could certainly escalate that situation. All right, next slide, please. So these are some things to consider based on the situation that might be in front of you. So if a survivor does receive an order of protection, reviewing what it covers, it might include removing and excluding the respondent, who's the abusive partner, from that residence. If the abuser is on the lease, have they breached the lease? So is there something you can do as the landlord to evict based on health or safety of other tenants, or if, again, they've breached that lease? If the abuser has started residing there but is not a legal tenant, check the lease and with a lawyer about evicting him or her. If it's a situation where the abuser is not a tenant, but they've gained access to the survivor's keys, might you be able to change the locks? And I know oftentimes as a victim service agency, we might be assisting with the cost of that if it's something that's going to help the survivor to be safer. Or can you work with the survivor to mutually terminate the lease in order for them to move to a safe unit, whether it's another unit that you are able to provide or if there's another provider in the community who can assist them. You know, Hilary talked about it might be an unsafe situation, not just for them, but for neighboring tenants as well. So that might be the best situation for everyone. Next slide, please. And then this is more about just some considerations for approaching that potential survivor. So if you observe something that's concerning, trust your gut and have that conversation, but make sure to approach them one-on-one when that abusive partner is not around. So make it as safe a situation as possible, but ask if they're okay. Let them know that you're concerned and spell out specifically what you've noticed. Who knows, you might be wrong, or he or she may not be ready to disclose what they've experienced, but just knowing that you care enough to ask can make a really big difference to a survivor who's been isolated. If the survivor does open up to you, tell them that you believe them, thank them for trusting you, and ask if there's anything you can do to help, and let them know that services are available. So this will take us back to our map of programs. And again, if you're one of that minority of people at the beginning who didn't know your local program, please take the time to figure out who that might be. Or if you already know your local program, but you've not been able to make contact with them yet, please reach out. It's always encouraged to do that before that moment of crisis when you might need them. So if there's a way you can start that relationship prior to then, again, to share materials, to get brochures, to have them come out and speak, that's always a great partnership to build. I'm going to turn it back over to Lee or John if there's any questions.
Thank you, Leah. We appreciate that. That was some wonderful tips and that can be very easily implemented. And we hope that the property managers and landlords that are on the call will consider some of those options. We do want to open it up for questions. If you'd like to type those into the chat box and the questions. I know that sometimes these are very complicated situations.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. I do have some questions here from the audience. I'll go ahead and read through them. The first one is, and this is John Turner from NIFA, by the way, lurking in the background. Has there been any discussion to updating the language on the power and control chart from she, her to they, them to include all genders?
Yes, thank you, John. And this is Lee. There are a wide variety of versions of the power and control wheel. That one was created several years ago, probably about 20 years ago. And so there are a wide variety of variations, which are more inclusive of the experiences of individuals who might be impacted by domestic violence. So for example, there is a particular wheel specific to immigrants and refugees, to folks who are in same-sex relationships, to teen dating violence, that highlights the tactics that abusers might be using if they're trying to inflict abuse on their survivors. The important thing to remember is that abusers are going to use the tactics that are going to work, and so when you look at each of those wheels, they include specific tactics that might affect that survivor that is in that population. So for example, for immigrants, they may be threatening to take away the papers if they are the person in the relationship who speaks English and the other person doesn't, using that against them, threatening to have them deported. For persons in same-sex relationships, threatening to out them to their employers or to family and friends if they aren't open and out with their status. So there's a wide variety of them. I think there's probably a good 25 different of the variations on that. And so yes, the one that we had today is the original one, but there are some that are more inclusive on that.
Okay, thanks. Next question is,
to cut you off real quick, John, can I get the panelists to share their cameras again?
Oh, sure. Thanks, Joe.
Thank you.
Okay. Have the agencies seen a victim protected from eviction from HUD housing through the use of the VAWA lease addendum?
Yes, I have. Is there a second part maybe to that question, or are they just interested if it's been in use here in Nebraska?
I think it's just asking if it's been in use. So that's good to hear that it has.
Yeah, and I don't want to speak for other areas of the state, but in Lincoln, our local continuum of care, part of our Lincoln Homeless Coalition is we formed a task force on making sure that we were all adhering to VAWA and were approaching it through the same way and talking to landlords about it with similar language.
Okay, thank you. Then we have a question here. This is from a housing authority. How do we get tenants to reach out to make a police report so that they do not lose their Section 8 due to violence in the home?
Well, it's important to know that for some survivors, they're not comfortable reaching out to the police. As we noted earlier, sometimes they don't want the abuser to go to jail. They just want the abuse to stop. So they may have concerns about that. They may also have particular concerns about reaching out to the police. They may have not had positive interactions with them in the past. Although all of our programs have done great work in working with law enforcement across the state, educating them, and many of our law enforcement organizations have gone to great lengths to learn more about appropriate responses to domestic violence. The fact is that abusers are really manipulative, and so often when law enforcement comes to the door, what they see is a survivor who is crying and just frantic and or angry and very emotional. And sometimes those abusers are calm and cool and collected, and they will say that she was the one that was being abusive and being violent. Sometimes they say that she was being suicidal and that they were restraining her. I mean, they will come up with all sorts of situations and excuses for why there may have been a disturbance at the household. So, you know, for a survivor having experienced that, you know, a few times, are often then just hesitant to call at all. Abusers will also threaten the survivor that if they do call the police, that the abuser will then take the children, will call CS on the person, will do all of those tactics that we saw in the parent control wheel to basically make things more miserable for the survivor. And the fact is that if law enforcement shows up and arrest isn't made, you're leaving then the abuser in the household with the survivor, and the repercussions and the violence that will occur after the fact, after law enforcement leaves the household, are pretty brutal. And survivors know this. They know what their abusers are capable of. So oftentimes there is a hesitancy to call law enforcement. On the outside, we all think, oh, that would be an easy thing to do. You call law enforcement, the person is arrested, they're jailed, problem solved. But that really doesn't always play out that way. So we understand that sometimes if you have a subsidized housing program, you're wanting to get law enforcement involved as a means to mitigate that issue that's occurring within your complex. But for the survivor themselves, that may not be the safest option.
Yeah, that's a great answer, Lee. And I would just add, if there's someone that isn't willing or ready to call law enforcement, to provide that information for your local DV program, because they may be able to do other levels of safety planning with them. And because of the level of confidentiality that we have through that state and federal law, that might feel more comfortable for them as a starting point.
Okay, thank you. Looks like the last question is kind of more of a statement. At my previous property, we had a safety plan on the property for our domestic violence victims. We used it several times and worked with our neighboring businesses to help with the plan. I encourage others to do the same.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So that concludes the questions that came in. Joe, I'll hand it over to you to close things out.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. That was fantastic. It's such an important topic, and this was far and away the most education I've had on it. I know that I always thought of domestic violence as being hard to detect because the criminals are perpetrating in the privacy of their own homes, and hearing something about, the guy camping out at a bank and screaming there, how often is there something that overt to respond to?
I think once
Well,
oh, sorry. I was just going to say, I think once you recognize all those tactics, you start to see it. It's kind of one of those things, once you learn it, you can't unsee it. And so if people are thinking only of the physical abuse or the sexual abuse or the woman with the black eye, they are going to miss a lot of those more subtle tactics. And the truth is that survivors are often trying to hide it because that's what's safest for them. So on one hand, maybe you'll be more aware of it. And on the other hand, don't be surprised if you don't see it, because survivors do a really good job of trying to stay safe.
I think it's important. I just want to highlight once more something that Linda said earlier in the presentation. Often the question that gets asked is, why does the survivor not just leave the relationship? And what we should be asking is, why doesn't the abuser stop the behavior? We need to hold abusers accountable. This is, it's a public health crisis. There are many things that as community members and partners and landlords and property managers that you can do to be part of the solution, and holding the abusers accountable and not blaming the victim goes a long way towards that, and maintaining stability for then the families that are trying to keep themselves and their families safe. So we appreciate the interest in this topic, and we appreciate you having us today.
Thank you all so much. That was such a great talk. I enjoyed it so much. Please tune back in a week from today for another edition of Networking with NIFA. The topic then will be highlighting locally produced food resources. Our speakers will be in NIFA's Dudley Beyer, Alex McKiernan from Robinette Farms, Justin Jones from Lone Tree Foods, and Amy Tabor from Open Harvest. It'll be an interesting conversation, so don't forget to register at NIFA.org for this and the rest of our upcoming events. Thank you again to our moderator, all the speakers. Thank you everybody for tuning in, and we'll see you next week.